This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from? Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindelof.
And I'm Frida Wara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindelof.
And I'm Frida Wara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. Frida, today we've got a really interesting conversation. Tell me a little bit about what's going on here today.
Well, you know, Walt, our Native American history in this country is fascinating. And we don't know enough about it. Frankly, I don't. And then when it comes down and you narrow it down to our Lake Superior, our Anishinaabe, our Ojibwa, our Chippewa, those stories are just really fascinating to me to understand the life path, where those stories have led us.
And one of the things that's always interesting to me is that when we hear the concept or the talk about Native Americans and Native Americans in our region, that you have to understand and keep in mind that this is not something from the history books. This ties into what we're talking about today with contemporary art. And that's what's really interesting to me.
And that's where we've got Anna to help us. And Anna Deschampe is here from Grand Portage National Monument. She is the Chief of Interpretation up there. And Anna, welcome to the show. You've got such great news to share with us.
Hi, Walt and Frida. Thank you so much for having me. I absolutely do. I think this is a really tremendous announcement that the U.S. Postal Service is making, that Grand Portage artist George Morrison has been honored with a 2022 commemorative stamp from the U.S. Postal Service. And so along with that, Grand Portage National Monument will serve as the host for the first day of issue stamp ceremony held on April 29th at Grand Portage National Monument.
Now, this is really exciting because it not only ties in the history and the community, but also the monument. Tell us a little bit about the work of George Morrison.
Well, George Morrison is a Grand Portage tribal member, and we're really fortunate and honored to have his son Breon on the line with us today as well. You know, as the facilitator or host of this ceremony, our real goal here is to work with Breon and the family of George to be able to understand who he is as an artist, but also who he is as a person, so that we can plan a really good event that really, really celebrates his life and celebrates his work. So George Morrison, as everything I understand, is a self-described formalist, was the way that he described his art. And I think I'm going to turn to Breon here to really, describe George's art and his work over his lifetime.
Yeah, Breon, welcome to the program here. We're glad to have you on. Breon Morrison, who is the son of George Morrison. Yeah, tell us about this, that you're George's only child, but can you share the path that led to your father becoming an artist? What was the background? Did he come from a family of art? Tell us about him.
Okay, well, he was the third of 12 kids born in Chippewa City, right outside of Grand Marais, and he was born in 1919. And I know that his dad, which was my grandfather, was a trapper. And, they were poor and they lived off the land, and they were pretty crafty in the sense that they made things, and, they used their hands to make crafts and to do chores and to live and stuff. But I think that's how he first got into art, as a young child, doing crafts.
Brian really had a remarkable journey, though, because his early years were difficult, very difficult, particularly health-wise. Can you share a little bit more about those early years?
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, he was born in 1919, and then when he was around 6 years old, he went to live in Hayward, Wisconsin, at a boarding school with his older brother. Okay, and at that time, he contracted tuberculosis that settled in his hip, in his left hip, and so he had an operation where they removed the hip bone, and that was at the Shriners Hospital in Minneapolis, and he was in a full body cast for about a year. And I believe at that time, since he was bedridden, he, read for one, and did crafts and drawing and stuff like that.
I can't imagine, Brian. I've raised a couple of children, and just trying to have a child at such formative years, immobilized with a full body cast. Did your dad talk about those years much?
No, he did not. As a matter of fact, I really didn't even know that the whole story like I just told it. I didn't know it until after he died.
Wow.
So he didn't really talk much about it, because I know that there was a second operation that fused his bones together. So his left hip would not bend. And the reason they did that is so he could walk straighter. And the operation was a success. So he, carried on his life and being able to do, most everything.
Obviously, there were challenges with that, Brian, but also with going to Hayward and going to the school, the boarding school. How did that impact him or affect him, especially in the creative process of developing this art?
That's one thing that he did not talk much about to me. And as a matter of fact, I really don't know. I mean, he never really mentioned much of it. And I believe that he wanted to protect me, from, feeling bad, about what he went through. And then really the reason why he went, he was sent there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I certainly understand that. But Anna, do you have anything on that too? Your thoughts?
I was just going to add, I mean, I obviously don't know his experience personally, but what I think is really interesting and really super admirable about George and the path that his career ended up taking after these experiences was that he chose to become an educator. So there was something within his formative experience there that I would say gave him that drive to not only create, I mean, obviously as an artist, that he was able to create, but also share with so many people through the scope of where his work went. Internationally, his work is renowned internationally. And then to become a, art teacher and a mentor to so many people. And, as people have approached me about the stamp and the excitement around this, a lot of what I've heard is that he was such a good and influential teacher. So, in some respects, I think that, however he was able as a young child to cope, he was also able to thrive and to cultivate that skill as an educator.
As an adapter, it just seems so amazing. When I was reading, and there's a fabulous book out there we can share with our listeners. It's called Turning the Feather Around, My Life in Art. And it's George Morrison's memoir as told to Margot Fortunato Galt. And it was written back in the 1990s, 1998, I think it was published. And I read, Brian, that your dad, he basically up to the age of 6 in the household was speaking the native language. But of course, when he went away to school, those things change. His body changed for him at such a young age where he's, kind of in those, that bedridden state that, you just can't move. And look at any child, you can't get them to sit still for 15 minutes. So how George was able to adapt and learning all the while, learning languages, learning how his life was going to be changed, and then inputting this artistic thread through his life, because I think his observation skills were just amazing, that his life was still what he could observe from him and from around him. And I guess I'm trying to put that all into the perspective of how those are foundations that bring us to become an artist. I think, do you believe that your dad had any other choice in life but to be an artist and an educator?
Well, looking back, it sure does seem that way, But I think he just got lucky, He discovered something. He had skills, he had talent, and he excelled at it. And then he stayed on it, and then got to do it. And that that's just a good testament to success.
We are talking today on the Lake Superior podcast with Anna Deschampe, who is the Chief of Interpretation at Grand Portage National Monument. Also, Brian Morrison, who is the son of George Morrison, artist who is being recognized with a U.S. Postal Service commemorative stamp. And we're talking about the life of George Morrison. But also, Anna, I'd like to ask you, can you give us an idea of what Grand Portage was like in this era that we're talking about? George was born in 1919. You've had this time of the early 20s through the Depression. What was Grand Portage like, to the best of how you can tell us?
Sure, absolutely. Like Brian mentioned earlier, George was born in Chippewa City, which is just outside of Grand Marais, Minnesota, which is approximately 30 miles from the Grand Portage Reservation. So the Grand Portage Reservation was created in the Treaty of 1854, and the land that was ceded, to the federal government did not include Chippewa City. It was further north than that. So during the time of, the 1920s, there were at the height around 200 Anishinaabe families living in this area. And the person that I cite for that is a Grand Portage Anishinaabe researcher and writer named Stacy Droulard, who writes an excellent book and a radio series on WTIPN radio called Walking the Old Road, A People's History of Chippewa City and the Grand Marais Anishinaabe. So around that time, in 1917, was when the first highway that connected Duluth to the Canadian border of the Pigeon River was built. So that was Old Highway 61, and it was away from the lake a little bit. So what we're seeing in that period of time is a period where Grand Portage is kind of transforming. And, the Ojibwe people of this area here, you were seeing them opening some restaurants, having some cabins, and then souvenir shops. And that is really one thing that I think really ties in with the art and how people perceive what Native American art or Ojibwe art is, that you would have, tribal members selling their art to different tourists that are coming up to the North Shore. So there, of course, we're talking about things like, beadwork and birch bark basketry, hook rugs, that kind of stuff that really creates an image of what Ojibwe art looks like, right? And I think that is a really cool connection to make, because then you have an artist, like George Morrison, who is very, very talented, but does not create that type of art that has now become an image of what art from a Native American should look like.
And that's something I want to ask you on, is like, you talk about how George's work kind of went against that. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, that was kind of one of the reasons why he's being recognized with this stamp, is the quality and the style of work that he did was really different from what I guess we thought, and I don't like using the word traditional, but the usual or the trope of Native art is. He went in a completely different direction, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one really challenging thing sometimes about being an Indigenous person, is there's a tremendous amount of conversations that revolve around identity, and how you choose to express yourself and how you choose to express your identity. And especially at that time, Native people weren't necessarily accepted in all of the mainstream circles or in different areas of our society, so it took a lot of courage and an incredible amount of talent for him to be not only accepted but really highly regarded in these circles where Ojibwe people just typically weren't at the time.
To begin with, and Brianne, you could speak to this, I'm sure, just to graduate from high school in 1938. I mean, that was, I believe, about 17% of the population during the Depression was actually graduating from high school. And your father did that coming out of a family of 12 and went on to college.
What was it like for him?
He was a smart guy. He was the only guy and the only family member to graduate from high school. And then you're right, he got a scholarship to go study art at the Minneapolis School of Art, which is now the College of Art and Design. And he graduated there first in his class in 1942. And then he did get then another scholarship, Vanderlip traveling scholarship, to go to New York and then study art there at the Art Students League. And he he fulfilled his wishes.
Well, and then it didn't stop there either. To go on in the early 50s, was that a Fulbright scholarship that took him to Paris?
That's true. That's right. Yep. Yeah. He got a Fulbright to go to France, and then went and spent time in Paris and then the south of France, and studied art and was part of the art scene there.
What I'm hearing beyond here is that, you were talking about the conversation earlier here was about how your father was an educator also. It sounds like education, learning, all of that, and all of these new ways really influenced him to say he wanted to impart and share this knowledge as well, which I know also that's a part of Native culture with elders and information. How did that all come together? I mean, were there some people maybe that influenced him that, maybe showed up in some way? Maybe he had a teacher, who knows what it was, but what are your thoughts on that got him to that point? That, like, what were some of the influences that created him as the person he became?
Right. Well, okay, so, and I think it's all about trying to make a living. It's like being able to support yourself and then still, do your art, right? And so teaching is one way to do that, and so he did, and then that's where he met my mother in 1960 at the Dayton Art Institute in Dayton, Ohio. And then they met, and then they went off to New York. And so then, as my mother tells me, is that he had to decide if he was going to get a straight job, which would be teaching, or if he was going to, try to hit it big as an artist. And so, obviously he, took the teaching route, and then in 1960, I think 3 or 4, he taught at the Rhode Island School of Design, and that's when that's when I came on the scene.
But your dad, I mean, he hung out with the big boys. I mean, let's go back to that time in France. So post World War II, that's also the time, I know a little bit more about the literary figures. So Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Eugene Ionesco, and your dad was hanging out with William de Kooning and Franz Klein and Jackson Pollock. I mean, that's some heavy hitters.
Yeah, that's
heavy hitters
yes.
for,
Right, yeah. You bet. Uh-huh.
But I bet
you. So in New York, right when I was born, and right before, my dad was there in New York, and he lived in the Lower East Side of New York, so the East Village, and a lot of artists did, and he was friends with all of that you mentioned, de Kooning and Franz Klein, and they all hung out in a bar called the Five Spot in Greenwich Village, and several jazz musicians like Thelonious Monk and Jerry Mulligan, they played there too. So they were all part of the scene, and then also poets, all sorts of poets, and so that this whole, the picture of this whole, art scene in New York is exactly where what was happening when I was born.
Yeah.
But then when I didn't really know much. I mean, I wasn't there. I was in Providence, Rhode Island, when my dad was teaching at RISD, and we still had an apartment in New York, and so we went back quite frequently. And then also we had a home in Provincetown, Massachusetts, on the tip of Cape Cod. And we spent our summers there. And then, so all of our friends from New York and us, we all kind of converged in Provincetown in the summers. And so, that's how I've always been so tight with New York. I have a lot of connections there.
We're talking today with Breon Morrison. He is the son of George Morrison, an artist who is being commemorated with a commemorative U.S. postage stamp for his work. Also with us on the podcast today is Anna Deschampe, who is the chief of interpretation at Grand Portage National Monument. And this is something that I definitely wanted to ask you, Breon, is that in terms of your father, the creativity, the work, and even I know yourself as a musician, elements of life on Lake Superior and then life on Cape Cod and being near big water. What are some of perhaps the elements of that really worked, if at all, to inspire your dad with the work that he created?
Right. Well, yeah, I was thinking about that, and he was a. I think of him as an abstract expressionist painter, and that's the art movement in New York in the 50s, and that has to do with expression of your medium, which is your paint and form and color and all those elements of art. And I think of him as an abstract expressionist. And then, it was already mentioned that he considered himself a formalist. And so that's also what my mother, refers to him as a formalist. So the answer to that is that, he was a painter. He was a visual artist. So what he experienced as a child and through his life and what he saw, get translated into his work. And since he was an abstract expressionist, which is about, about expressing yourself, with color and your lines and strokes and stuff.
And the horizon line.
Yeah.
Breon, his work is so noted by the horizon line.
Yeah, that's his signature motif, in his work. I always thought that came from Provincetown, but then after he moved up to Grand Portage in 1983, then I realized that the horizon line is definitely Lake Superior.
Can you tell me, Breon, a little bit about his Ojibwa name, his native name that I understand translates into standing in the Northern Lights? Can you tell us what that is and a little bit about it?
Yeah, okay. So now an elder who lived up here His name was Walter Caribou, and he was a friend of my father. They were very good friends. And and my father asked Walter if he would, give him a name. And so Walter had these dreams, and the dreams were Wawateganegabo, which is standing in the northern lights, and then the other one is turning the feather around. And then I'm sorry, I can't remember the Ojibwe word.
Anna, could you tell us a little bit about with these festivities and things that are going to be held? What's going to be going on? What are some of the festivities that you have planned around this commemoration of George Morrison at Grand Portage National Monument?
Absolutely. So on April 29th, we are hosting the first day of issue stamp ceremony, along with the U.S. Postal Service and the family of George Briand and the rest of his family. And on that day, we will have in the front yard, in front of the Great Hall, a series of speakers and events. And in addition to that, we're also opening an exhibit in the second floor of the Heritage Center of George's art. And it'll have several pieces of his art that are done throughout his life. They'll be on display. And it'll include paintings, drawings, and sculptures. So the goal of that is to really showcase pieces that were inspired by Lake Superior. That's the direction that we're moving with the exhibit. So we're looking at pieces that are inspired by Lake Superior, Grand Portage, and Cook County as well. So this exhibit is going to be on display through October of 2022. As soon as the schedule of events is announced, it'll be on the Grand Portage National Monument website, which is nps.gov/GRPO.
Okay. Now, Brianne, I have to ask you this question. With all of this recognition and this commemoration, is there thoughts maybe you have on what your dad might say about all of this?
Well, he would have thoroughly loved it, because he was such a fan of stamps. He wasn't like a formal collector, a stamp collector or anything, but he loved the stamps, the designs, and he saved all sorts of stamps, and we have a big box of all the stamps that he saved. So he would be so happy to do this and overjoyed.
Just a good wrap up, kind of a full circle on it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is there anything you guys want to add into this conversation here that we didn't touch on? I mean, we were kind of hopping around some of the questions and everything. I mean, is there anything that we didn't, if Rita and I didn't hit on, that maybe you want to add?
I can say that I think that this is important for the people of Grand Portage, and I think it's important for Native artists who are trying to do their thing, and it's good for art and artists alike.
Brianne, you shared with me that it was always your father's dream to be able to go to New York City and to be an artist and be recognized. And more than anything, I understand the power of a dream, the power of a dream of a young lad, one of 12, who really gets, many ways, the wind knocked out of your sails at very early age of your life, but you don't let it keep you down. It's an amazing story. I'm so glad that we're going to get an opportunity to share it with more folks.
That's great. I just love hearing that. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Anna, how about you? Is there any particular points maybe with the exhibition, with the commemoration that you want to make sure people know about, or have we kind of hit it all?
I just really want to share how proud and excited Grand Portage National Monument is to be able to facilitate and share the legacy, of such an important event, but also a really special man.
That's Anna Deschampe, who is the Chief of Interpretation at Grand Portage National Monument, and also Brianne Morrison, who is the son of George Morrison, artist being recognized with a commemorative stamp and special ceremonies and events at Grand Portage. This has really been cool talking with you guys. This has been a fascinating conversation about somebody that I'm just literally, Brianne and Anna, learning about here with this chat, and this has been wonderful.
You're welcome.
Thank
you.
Thank you so much for having us.
That's Anna Deschampe, who is the Chief of Interpretation at Grand Portage National Monument, and also Brian Morrison, the son of George Morrison, the artist who's being recognized with that commemorative stamp by the U.S. Postal Service, and so much more. Frida, that was a wonderful chat.
You know, I just love... We say that we're made stronger by stories, and some of those stories that just come forward, and imagining what it was like to grow up during the Depression and all of the ins and outs and the way a life journey takes you around the world, basically. But he had to return to that beloved Lake Superior.
Yeah, there's nothing like, how that can inspire art. I mean, you and I have talked about it on the podcast here about art can be inspired by many different things: hardship, goodness, the natural beauty around us, and all of the challenges. And it's really great that this is happening with George Morrison, who maybe a lot of people are just learning about with this podcast, and that's what this is all about. So this has really been wonderful. We do want to thank everybody for listening to this latest episode of the Lake Superior podcast, and encourage you to find us online and send us maybe some story ideas. We want to hear from you.
Absolutely. Let's have some feedback here. If you've enjoyed it, places that you'd like us to kind of dig a little bit deeper, and keep listening.
That's going to do it for us today, but certainly we'll have more episodes all available online. You can find them through the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation website, and we'll do it again next time with the Lake Superior podcast. I'm Walt Lindola.
I'm Frida Wara. Thanks for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Wara.
And I'm Walt Lindola. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?